have heard, we have the Rolling Stones of political science, at least in publication terms. I've been looking at the Griffith website, which again is wrong and outdated, but just with that, Pat, if I've been counting correctly, is about 70 journal articles, over 80 book chapters, editor, co-editor, or author of about 40 books, XU, author of 12 books at least, again, at least 18 chapters, at least 26 articles. So yeah, Mick Jagger would love to have that. Not only that is the amount, like, you know, as you guys know, both Pat and XU are dear colleagues and they are extremely collegial, and also thank them for the presentation, but also for like all the time they take with at least, you know, at least they have taken it with me reading my drafts and redrafts and again, and discussions and everything. So thanks very much for all your guidance and help through the years. Now the floor is yours, guys. You know how it's devoted, 40-45 minutes max, and then we'll open for Q&A. So Pat, XU, you go. Thank you.
I'll start. You move to the next slide, or maybe the first one. The notice you got on the seminar of the title of today, it's a Defending IO's False Prophecy. What does that mean? I have no idea. When Farhan asked me whether we have a paper, we could give a paper, I said, yes, sure. Then I turned to Pat, I said, what's the title? He said, Defending IO's False Prophecy. A couple of days later, I asked him, what does that mean? He said, I don't know. Anyway, the real title of the paper is International Organizations and the State Sovereignty. As you can see, it's about really the WHO and the COVID-19. And that's part of the reason. Are you going to move next slide? Yes. That's the reason I said probably we should not have written this paper in the first place. We shouldn't, because we do not do health. Sarah does, we don't. We do IOs, we don't do health. So this is a kind of a playing fool in front of an expert. Unfortunately, she's teaching right now. And second, the paper was written really in frustration. You don't write a paper when you're frustrated because you tend to be argumentative rather than just give a deep analysis, but we did it anyway. The third reason the paper probably should not have been written is we wrote the paper, started early April, I think, finished the end of May or mid-June or whatever, but no, the mid-May. So you don't write something while the pandemic is still evolving. But as I said, with UIOs, we try to use this case to show something about how the international organizations work. And the fourth one, the paper should not have been written. It was everything against how I was trained. I was told specifically you do not comment on current affairs because you're not a journalist. So this is everything against what I was educated. But we wrote it. Why we wrote the paper? First, we want to, in many ways, clarify the main media report, some of the facts over WHO and over COVID-19, particularly how WHO worked over this epidemic. And second, we really want to make this into a bigger one. Bigger issue is the relationship between international organizations and the state, particularly state as sovereign with their sovereignties. Then I'll give everything to Pat. He will do the rest of the paper. He gives a real paper. I'm only giving the reason why we shouldn't have written the paper. Go ahead.
Oh dear. First, I apologize for the title. It seemed a good idea at the time, but I couldn't remember why later. But it was written out of this sense of frustration about people talking about what the WHO should do, who ought to know better about what the roles of international organizations are. So this is a paper really about the WHO as an institution rather than the WHO as a health institution. Unfortunately, Sarah isn't online because she's written a couple of books on this general topic and can answer all the details far better than we can. But we're interested in this as part of a larger studies of what we do on international organizations and the way they work and the threats that they're under in more recent times. Not just new, they've been under threat almost ever since they existed. But the ones that seem to be rather more pressing and in times of crisis, like the last 6 months, any tensions which exist become that much more evident and that much more apparent as the pressures sort of threaten to tear it apart. So, the first most obvious pressure is, what is the World Health Organization when we're dealing with it? And it seems to be important that we look at it in two different ways. Firstly, the World Health Organization is a multi-member international governing organization of about 190 member states, all of whom participate in its activities, all of whom have opinions about what it should be doing, and all of whom have a nominal vote in the World Health Assembly, which meets annually, and in the executive board, which meets on a more regular basis. They decide the fundamentals of what the World Health Organization can or cannot do. The second part of it is the World Health Organization Secretariat, which are the membership, the international civil servants from multiple countries who participate in the activities of running the WHO on a daily basis. And very often I think people elide the two and assume that when they're talking about the one, they're talking about both at the same time. When they accuse one or the other, it becomes difficult to work out precisely what they're talking about. This came up particularly in this crisis, in the first weeks of the crisis, when people started saying, well, why doesn't the World Health Organization include Taiwan? Why is Taiwan not involved in participating in the activities? Well, the big issues, membership of the World Health Organization, are decided by member states. Member states technically have one vote each, although apart from leadership elections, elections of the Director General, they very, very seldom actually vote. So the membership of the organization is determined as a UN organization by the members. And when China replaced Taiwan on the UN, the World Health Assembly duly replaced Taiwan with China as a member of the World Health Organization. And that's pretty well the story. The people are accusing the Secretariat of failing to do what member states do. And the Secretariat can merely shrug its shoulders and say, basically, this is above my pay grade. This isn't something which we as the Secretariat can do. It's something that the United Nations, and the WHO is a specialized agency of the United Nations, actually do rather than anything that the membership can do. Which doesn't mean that the Taiwanese health authorities were not involved all the time in the activities which were going on in dealing with the COVID-19. In fact, very early in the piece, delegates from Taiwan were involved in visiting Wuhan to try and work out what was happening. They have been alerted all the time to the particular proposals, what should happen, and it's probably no coincidence that Taiwan has one of the best records in controlling the virus and in maintaining absolutely minimal deaths when it comes to it. They were involved all the time. They just weren't formally members or possibly even having observer status. But that's a decision for the member states and for the World Health Assembly, not for the WHO itself. So we need to anticipate what it is they do. The second thing about member-driven organizations are that the Secretariat can do whatever the member states permit it to do, and all the constraints that they choose to put upon it are real constraints in which they can operate. It's actually been interesting watching, as I haven't, but I know XU has, almost the daily press conferences given since January by the senior members of the World Health Organization. I think from about 25th or so of January, they've done it on a daily basis, which is now down to 3 weeks, in which they answered the questions of the world's press about anything to do with the COVID and what's coming. You have the Director General Tedros, you have the head of the infectious diseases and crises, which is Michael Ryan, and you have the person responsible for the precise outbreak of these things, who's an American. So you have these three, plus other people being brought on at different times, answering questions all the time about why are you doing this, why are you doing that? And a lot of the time being asked why you don't intervene. Why don't you come and tell, Brazilian journalists asked, our president to do things? And Mike Ryan, who is the Irish by origin, sort of tends to answer, well, we do what we have the power to do. We have the power of persuasion. We don't have the power to order. We can ask people what to do. We can suggest they do things. We're not in a position to tell them what they're doing. So the WHO is limited. It's also worth commenting the WHO is, according to one comment, about the same size in terms of people and budget as an average medium-sized university teaching hospital. So think of the Gold Coast University Teaching Hospital and think of that as, I presume it's probably average size, about the size of the World Health Organization with its 193 members and worldwide scope. And you start understanding some of the limitations which are going to exist on that and any other international organizations. They have a high profile. They don't always have the resources and the people which are going to go with them. But if you talk about the Secretariat, they are very much a case of health for everyone. The objective of the World Health Organization is health for all. And if you actually ask the people again, it doesn't actually remember if they're currently members of the World Health Organization or not. Their objective is to achieve it for all those people. So we need that distinction between the two before, if we're going to understand what it is that they're doing. Now, a little bit of the detail. And this is where I wish Sarah was here to help us along, because she's written precisely on these topics. International health organizations actually have a long history. The first time you had an organization concerned with health across borders goes back to, I think, about 1902 in the American, when the Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO, P-A-H-O, was created in the Americas to deal with an outbreak of yellow fever on the grounds that the viruses don't know international boundaries, so you have to have some sort of international organization. So PAHO existed since 1902. When the World Health Organization was created in 1948, PAHO becomes one of the regional bodies of that organization. So the whole argument about World Health Organizations, or one of the points, was to deal with infectious diseases, and international health regulations were established to try and encourage surveillance and reporting across diseases, although in 1951, they were actually limited to a comparatively small number of diseases. They've had some great successes, like the abolition of smallpox, the reduction of polio. They've had some failures. Whole attempts to roll back malaria haven't worked. They struggled when it came to dealing with AIDS. And in the early 2000s, when Ebola hit West Africa, the argument was, did they have enough power, enough influence to do whatever it was that was needed? And they had at that time a director general called Gro Harlem Brundtland. She was a doctor, a former Prime Minister of Norway, described in one stage as Norway's own Iron Lady, who was elected unusually to head the World Health Organization rather than the people who had been involved within the organization for most of their careers. And she, in fact, chastised China when it came to the SARS outbreak for failing to adequately inform them. And it wasn't only China that she annoyed the Canadians as well, because she actually gave a travel advisory suggesting people shouldn't visit Toronto because of an outbreak of SARS, which had occurred in Toronto. So there was an agreement in 2005 to extend the powers of the World Health Organization, to give it authority to carry out more extensive surveillance and reporting and giving travel advisories and generally sort of identifying what was happened when it came to transnational migrations. It was at one stage actually called an outbreak of post-Westphalian organization, though it has in fact fallen far short of that. And even when the member states agreed to do that, they left themselves an out. And as the legal advisor, Berku of the World Health Organization said, they left an out which said they didn't actually have to obey all the orders and they could ignore some of them if it was convenient, because it's remained the state that the actually dealing with outbreaks was always going to be a matter for individual nation states. But it also said that before the World Health Organization could act, it had to act on advice. And it sets up a health emergency committee. And health emergency committee includes about 20 odd people from a long list of possible people from all areas of medical pandemic science, which were going to advise the Director General on whether or not the particular events consisted of a public health emergency of international concern, PHEIC, perhaps unfortunately, occasionally pronounced as fake. So are you going to announce a fake? And if you were, it wasn't going to be the Director General on his own, it was going to be the Director General on the advice of the members of the Health Emergency Committee. I think this is important because many of the accusations about the WHO these days suggesting it didn't act fast enough or it failed to give due advice. Well, if we actually look at the timelines for the COVID-19, it's first identified on the 31st of December. The International World Health Organization is advised on about the 2nd of January. They send out the first warning about the possibility of this disease on the 5th of January to all its hospitals and member states, 5th of January. On the 20th of January, the 21st of January, the Director General calls a meeting of the Health Emergency Committee. So you get these number of people from different countries asking, does this constitute the conditions for declaring a fake? And they can't agree. They're divided. He asked them to come back the next day. They're still divided. Now, at the time, nearly all the cases are still in Hubei province and all in China. So the argument, he says at the moment, Tedros, the Director General, says, this isn't a fake yet, but be warned, it could easily become one. The day after that, the Chinese government locks down Wuhan city. A week later, he reconvenes the Health Emergency Committee, and this time they agree it possibly constitutes a fake, and he announces that it's a fake. Now, this is significant because this is about the highest level formally that the World Health Organization has. And it does it on advice, and it gives advice to the community that a fake is concerned. We'll talk about pandemics possibly later. So by the 28th of January, you have the World Health Organization announcing this is a problem and then seeing what happens. By this stage, a number of countries, including Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore, have started cracking down, and Hong Kong, have started cracking down on people coming in and out of the country. They've already acted. I mean, they possibly had the example of SARS, which had come earlier to understand what the potential problems were. But they've moved very fast, and at the end we'll come back to death rates, which is actually quite an important one. So the WHO can act on advice, only on advice, and it can give advice. It has no capacity, remember this budget, to do much more than say, this is what we think you should do, this is what we can identify. It doesn't have, in that sense, any operational arm to implement it, nor does it have the authority to tell individual governments what it is that they can do. The second thing they're doing at the same time is a massive amount of coordination which exists between individual countries. There's an organization called the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, which was set up to try and maintain reports from everywhere about what it is that happened. The WHO has a set of coordinating centers spread around the world in which people are nominated or declared as WHO coordinating centers, and they keep information flowing about what is happening where and to whom, and are reporting what is happening in terms of surveillance of any sorts of outbreaks. At the same time, they are managing to coordinate a whole series of international collaborations to try and solve those sorts of problems. So there's that outfit in Pittsburgh, which is collaborating with an organization in Paris and with an Austrian drug company receiving funding from Norway and from the Bill and Gates Foundations. So that's just one of the sorts of multiple organizations which we can list, which says these are people working through the WHO, which is coordinating the sorts of things that they're attempting to do. And that's important because when people start talking about people sitting on information, much of the information is much more, the medical networks are much more integrated, much more embedded than people actually think. The Wuhan Institute, which was being accused by the president of letting the virus out, includes a whole number at times of visiting scholars from other countries at the same time. One head of one of these organizations said it was actually fascinating to see it goes to work. And if I quote him, he said, now they're able to share findings with scientists around the world on a WHO conference call within 2 hours of making discovery. Then he said, it's pretty cool, right? You cut the crap and you get to the heart of a global enterprise. So the doctors at the time, the scientists at the time, are the people who are maintaining links through the WHO. This is much of the activity which is barely mentioned in the geopolitical arguments about what the WHO should be doing. You have coordinated international teams which are designed to understand what's happening and to try and find some sort of cures. And the Center for Disease Control, initially based in Atlanta, but now with different sort of equivalents being built up over the place, exchange staff much of the time in a way of finding out what's happening in different places. In the past 15 years, for instance, the US CDC has had 47 scientists working in the same building as the China CDC in Beijing. It has been reduced now as part of the desire to reduce collaboration with China, which is, I suspect, more at the cost of the people outside China. But these were collaborating, coordinated teams in which the WHO's international networks played a substantive role. So when we talk about what the WHO does, it's not just about what you see on the television, it's about the connections which are going to be designed to help to try and provide some sort of additional base. Now, health has always been political. That's pretty well inevitable. It's political because although we talk now about infectious diseases, there are, of course, other sorts of arguments about what the World Health Organization ought to be doing. So the expenditure, decisions on expenditure are going to vary from time to time. The current one, of course, is now being a highly political issue because the question is, who do you blame for the rank failures of governments to solve things? And at the present moment, the WHO is charged with those sorts of failures. It wasn't always. For a long time in America, the president was saying what a great job it was doing. But since then, the situation got worse, and they decided in America at least to stop funding the WHO. Is this new? Absolutely not. When there was an early pandemic in 1970s, the WHO was criticized for exceeding its authority by reporting an outbreak of cholera in Guinea. In the 80s and 90s, it overreached its mandate by demanding that countries report on HIV/AIDS cases. In 2003, it acted outside its authority by warning travelers not to travel to Hong Kong or Toronto or Taiwan. In 2009, it conspired with the pharmaceutical industry by announcing H1N1 was an influenza pandemic. It meant that all the countries listened to it, stocked up with diseases, and then found that much of its money was committed in warehouses to things they didn't want. So this was a conspiracy of the WHO with the pharmaceutical industries for not quite sure what reason, but there you are. This is the sort of crisis which actually occurs on those occasions. And I might add, in most of those cases, you can find the opposite occurred at the same time. Someone was criticizing them for not acting at the proper time. So the health crisis is the political issue, and the easiest person to blame is the World Health Organization. One could have a sort of bit of entertainment by reading the different things that the President Trump has said at different times, which started by saying that the Chinese are doing a great job, then saying that CDC and the WHO is doing a great job, and then complaining that it wasn't announced as a pandemic, and saying, I always knew it was a pandemic, even if he hadn't done anything about it. And of course, more recently arguing that we're not going to fund the World Health Organization because they could have stopped it happening and they didn't stop it happening. So everyone who dies as a consequence is the WHO's fault, despite the fact they have no operational issues. And it's going to be, of course, an election campaign. The three comments made by the National Republican Senatorial Committee advising senators on how to run their campaigns. They said there are four targets: China, the WHO, political correctness, and the Democrats. And it lists the crimes of the WHO. It abetted the Chinese and assisted their cover-up. It acted as the handmaiden of the Chinese Communist Party because China voted for Tedros as Director General, and therefore they owe him. Well, 120 out of 180 votes voted for Tedros, so there are a lot of debts there from different countries, which I think included Australia, voting for Tedros in this case. So the connection there, one vote is worth all of this? Probably not. And again, there's no evidence that as soon as they knew about it on the 31st, by the 5th of January, everyone else was informed. They found out about the virus on December the 30th, and it took them to March the 11th to declare it a pandemic. Well, yes, two things which are true, illustrating the comment that truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent, which is a quote from W.B. Yeats. Of course, but the pandemic was never the big issue when it came to the World Health Organization. The fake was. You announced that this is a crisis and this is the issue that we are going to talk about, and pandemic and epidemic is just a particular word which could be used. The rest of the world, I think, took rather more seriously the view, the idea that a pandemic was a step in the direction of saying this is a crisis. So the World Health Organization listened to everything they've been saying from about the 10th of January onwards. This is a crisis, it's going to happen, it's going to come, rather than listening to them using a particular word. And it kept reporting Chinese propaganda, the third claim that it was under control, even while it was whipping through Wuhan. And that therefore they shouldn't have supported what the Chinese did. You can look at the results which have come out in the different countries, which suggest that there is something about the way that some countries have managed it and some countries that have not. It's actually quite interesting if you look at the deaths per million, if you want evidence of what's going to happen. If you look at all countries in Asia and the Pacific, and these figures are the 12th of June, so it's a bit behind, but there is no country in Asia and the Pacific that has more than 10 deaths per million on June the 14th. 10 deaths per million. Australia's 4, of course. If you look at Europe, Britain is sitting at 621 per million. Sweden, 472. Denmark, 102. Norway, 46. 3 countries, same backgrounds, vastly different death rates which are going to be involved. So it's not just a matter of climate or ethnicity. It's also a matter of the way the countries with exactly the same backgrounds deal differently with particular problems. It's a national problem of governance as well as an issue of being a matter of health. So we're always getting these arguments about how this is going to be politicized. Tedros keeps saying, please don't make it political. It's inevitably political. And now we're going to start actually looking for issues of blame. So the big issues then become is, what is the future likelihood of IOs in an environment where they've always been blamed, but they're becoming increasingly marginalized, or people are attempting to marginalize them as a consequence of combination of geopolitical and increasingly nationalistic policies about lacks of cooperation between them. An international organization in these senses is made up of member states collaborating to achieve something which they cannot do on their own. The IO constitutes member states and the Secretariat, not just one or the other. And they work by a process of consensus on the areas determined by their mission and agreed by the member states. So we have all ranges of time saying the UN should have done this, the World Health Organization could do this. The World Health Organization is concerned with doing pretty well what its member states are agreed. Now, the Secretariat have expertise, the Secretariats have time. The World Health Organization is, in the scheme of things, a second tier international organization. It's not up there with the IMF and the World Bank, which are having impacts across the board. It's got a highly focused scheme, and most of the time, and obviously not the last 6 months, most of the time it receives comparatively little attention from the large countries with health schemes on which the World Health Organization is going to have no impact. But it has a great impact in international things, international collaboration, and it has great impact on the health organizations of small states. If you go to the places like the Pacific Islands, which have limited health capacity, limited health schemes, the advice that you can get is really important there from the World Health Organization. So the people we hear from the noise from, which are the large states, and the people who benefit from it are likely to be slightly different people in these sorts of organizations. So when you talk about the Pacific, they're not only interested in issues of infections, they're also interested in primary health care, on non-communicable diseases, on whole areas of diet and other things which can make a tremendous difference to the way they work. This is of comparatively minor relevance to the big states arguing about what the role of the WHO should be in sending instructions out to countries which are perfectly capable of going to continue to look after their own purposes. It leads to a particular dilemma about the role of people like Tedros, the Director General, because they sit there playing 3 multiple roles. This is a particular one that we're interested in teasing out. They're elected, and anyone elected is by definition a politician. Well, it's one way of describing a politician. You have 180 countries running campaigns to get people elected as leaders. At times in the past, you've had some highly distinguished people running for campaigns. It's possibly a comment, I'm not talking about WHO now. The list of candidates for the World Trade Organization, which is just closed, is probably less distinguished than most of the ones that we've had in the past, possibly because most countries have little interest in making it work, or in particular, the United States has little interest in allowing the World Trade Organization to work effectively, and its fights with other countries, in particular China, put the place in deadlock. But leaders and politicians in places like the World Health Organization helping to direct and nudge and put together alliances of what can actually happen. But they're also politicians because of whom they represent. It was very much a case in the World Health Organization that one of the factors was it was time Africa had a turn in producing a director general. So you had to find a competent person from an African country in order to put up as director general. So they've got to play a political game. They've got to deal with all these member states. Whenever people are saying, well, the World Health Organization is too reliant on China, the answer is, of course, you can only operate in China with the collaboration of the government, and you cannot pick your governments. So when Brazilian journalists in the annual press conference asked the World Health Organization, can it do something to persuade their president to take this virus seriously? The only answer they can give is, we deal with the people that are in power at the time. We don't pick and choose between who the governments are. And we need to work with the collaboration and cooperation of national governments. And if the Brazilian government doesn't want to do it, then there's very little we can do except give advice. We give advice, we can persuade. And as Michael Ryan, the WHO said, we're not the Security Council. We can't force anyone to do anything. And thirdly, leaders, rather than leaders, as managers have to mobilize their staff. Most of the WHO staff are medical. That's the dominant expertise which exists. Public health, virologists, a whole range of medical skills. Tedros himself is a public health expert. They have to manage to use their staff, use them better, and they've got to balance them between the two. And this is one of the things which people seldom take into account. The big issue then, what we're interested in, as XU suggested, is where does this go, and what's the future state likely position of international organizations going to be? Well, firstly, we like the notion that IOs are actually less than the sum of their parts. It's the reverse of the normal, that an organization is more than the sum of its parts. If you actually work out what the IOs do on the ground, and it's got five regions and about 120 country offices who do much of the operational advising. And if you actually look at the benefits they take there, they're often substantial for small countries in which they are working. They may not make a mark internationally, but if you look at all the little things they do, and if you talk to many of the staff who are in the field who like the little things they do, then it really becomes much more important to take account of what they do rather than what their headquarters do and what the big comments are. Secondly, it's always an issue of how you combine those two divergent, often, trends, the political notion of IOs and the technical notion of IOs. How do we combine them? It comes down to how important do countries think multilateralism is going to be. If there's an argument that everything has to be done bilaterally, if there's an argument that we no longer care about these things, or to take the American comment, we pay for it, other people benefit from it, which is only slightly true, then of course the argument will be that the international organizations will decline in influence. They won't disappear because it's too difficult to get rid of them, but they will decline in influence, they will decline in quality, and the consequence will be there's much less of that international collaboration, which, if you value it, is going to be very important. The argument in Australia about WHO was, of course, we support the WHO because of what it does in the Pacific. The argument about we should have an inquiry because it's failure, apart from sticking your head out rather stupidly, has always been un-Pacific. It's always said they did something wrong. We don't know what. And perhaps we started this paper trying to say, well, actually they've got things wrong, but they've not done most of the things for which they are charged, when people bother to charge them at all. And they're charged that because people haven't understood or don't attempt to understand the peculiar position of international organizations. We hope that this paper we wrote, which is coming out in a journal called Social Alternatives, which will be out in August, at least tries to raise some of those questions. It also raises the other questions about which we're interested in people's views on, about where they think the international organizations might go and what the consequences might be. Let me finish there, and I'll let XU answer most of the questions. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Pat.